Alright, hello everybody. My name is Hannah Holbert, and today we are going to be talking about Aipysurus laevis, the olive sea snake. And as you can see today, I am also an olive sea snake, so I will be bringing you through this experience as Aipysurus. So please enjoy. So we'll get into a little bit of the taxonomy here to start. If you watched my other video that covered sea crates, we'll be breaking down that again a little bit today, as we are looking at the sea snake group today instead. But we are still in the family Elapidae. These are in the advanced snake groups. This is subfamily Hydrophinae, and then Hydrophini is that subclade that we were talking about before, where you have sea snakes and crates in one group, and the general egg laying in the other. Then you have your genus, which is Aipysurus. So talking about those clades again, we have two general clades under the elapid group. So we have Hydrophini, which is the viviparous sea snakes that we'll be talking about today. It includes Aipysurus. And then you have Laevis, which includes the oviparous sea crates. So completely different reproductive strategies here, and they may have developed through different terrestrial characteristics over time, depending on where these organisms are found. So this is just another example of where Aipysurus lies on the tree. You can see they actually break off from the rest of Hydrophis pretty early on, and alongside Aipysurus as a genus, you can see that Amidocephalus is the only other really close relation member in the Hydrophinae. And then at the bottom here, you can see Elapinidae, um, which has a bunch of different species of elapids as well, but you can see how far away they are related. And sea crates, specifically Laudicata colubrina that I covered in my last video, you can see them all the way down here at the bottom of the tree, and they are very diverged from Aipysurus. So the genus Aipysurus in itself was described in 1804 by laevis, and this is a group of sea snakes, not sea crates. So you can see that there are 9 species in this genus, and there are 5 in Western Australia. This is an example of what Aipysurus laevis looks like here. You can see it's very large bodied in comparison to the sea crates, which are way more flattened and specialized. These snakes tend to be a little bit less advanced in their body adaptations and size range than some of the sea crates are, and they do not come up on the land at all. And then we will move on here to speaking of this species itself, the olive sea snake. Again, this species, Aipysurus laevis, was described in 1804, was one of the original that he described. And it's pretty interesting. It's the largest member of this genus. And there is another member named Shark Bay sea snake, also known as Aipysurus jukensi, which is a synonym for the species, which is also uh, published alongside Aipysurus laevis. They were originally thought to, be exactly the same thing, but they weren't 100% sure, so they separated them out when they were describing them, and now it's come down to them being synonyms for each other. So you can just call them the olive sea snakes. They have 3 regional populations, which may be separate species, but there is no current jurisdiction on the topic as of now. A lot of people are interested in learning about this taxonomy and doing the genetic work for them, as sea snakes are incredibly popular, but at the moment there hasn't been any more consistent splits in this group. There are 2 current subspecies. There's Aipysurus laevis and then Aipysurus laevis polarium. Both were also described by laevis and further separated out by other authors later down the road. So the etymology of the name, I thought it would be interesting to go into this a little bit, is apes means high or steep. So this all typically refers to the body shape of the snake. You can see they have that really high pyramidal shape to the body and the spine, where the body is more compressed towards the top and then much wider at the bottom. Aura relates to the tail. So again, they're talking about how high and steep that slope is leading to the tail, and how it has a very smooth body is what laevis typically refers to. So they have a very smooth body, their scales do not overlap, and that tail and their general body shape is laterally compressed, meaning their tail is super thin and is taller than it is wide. So it just refers to the general morphology of the snake, which I thought was pretty cool. So in terms of historical prevalence, the current extant marine snakes have actually evolved multiple times within independent lineages. We talked a little bit about Hydrophinidae. There's also Homolopsidae and Aquacordidae, which we mentioned in class. And I'm assuming we will be talking about them further, but lots of different variations on how things have evolved, some of them through terrestrial means, others through possibly aquatic species that have made it all the way over to Australia and then radiated out. And then 90% of the marine reptile population is made up by these marine elapids in total. So of course we know there's other marine reptiles, there's marine iguanas and things like that that exist, but in general over the entire world, 90% of that population is within these groups of snakes, which is pretty cool to me. So let's talk a little bit more about that morphology I mentioned. They are vertically flattened, as the name states. That paddle-shaped tail is incredibly important and seen in most sea snakes and sea kraits. It's very flat and thin and helps push them against the current in the ocean. They have valved nostrils, and they have a sublingual salt excretion gland, which helps them produce any excess salt that may be trapped in their body when they're ingesting water or food, just to make sure they're regulating their salinity. They can also reach depths greater than 70 meters and can remain submerged there for up to 2 hours, which is incredibly interesting. They can manage this by coming to the surface, taking very short, quick breaths, and then they will finish it with one large breath before they decide to dive super deep. And they also typically have larger lungs than terrestrial snakes do, so they're able to hold a lot more oxygen and saturate their body for a longer period of time than terrestrial or arboreal snakes would be able to. In terms of their distribution, they are typically found around the Australasian coral reef flats. So as you can see in this map here, that northern side of Australia that faces Indonesia is where they're typically found, along a bunch of different reefs up here. They're all across the northern Australian coast. You can find them in Papua New Guinea as well, but they are only in these aquatic environments. The Great Barrier Reef is a very large area for diversity here for these sea snakes and Aipysurus, and they're typically found along these coasts about 10 to 40 meters in depth in terms of the water that they reside in. They can also be found in the northeastern Pacific Ocean, but they often avoid open water areas and they stay towards the bottom near these coral reef areas where they can hide and find shelter and food. So in terms of behavior, you can see if you see videos of these guys or people interacting with them, they tend to be very solitary. They're not commonly aggressive to humans unless threatened. Often divers will interact with them, but they do not often bite. They are often also known to be nocturnal, so they hunt at night and they hide in the reef beds along the benthic environment at night, and they use the corals and rocks along the reef to remove their skin when they're sloughing it off, as well as algae or any other organisms that could be trying to connect to them on the outside of their scales. The overlapping scales that most other species of snakes have, again, are not found in the species, which helps prevent any parasites attaching to them, but of course, it still does occur as parasites continue to adapt to meet their survival needs. So as they continue to adapt, these snakes do have to manage that in one way or another to keep themselves safe. For the venom, in general, Elapidae is known to have extremely dangerous venom for humans specifically. It can be fatal, especially with Aipysurus laevis, and their toxins tend to be neurotoxic and myotoxic. This impacts the neuron transmitters and blocks them, and it also will attack the muscles. Both of these things can lead to paralysis when combined, as well as respiratory failure, which can be fatal and is extremely fatal in their prey. Speaking of their diet tends to be of coral reef benthic species, so they will eat on crabs, on prawns, cuttlefish that are found along the bottom of this ecosystem. They will use the coral reefs and look through the nooks and crannies along the substrate to find these organisms, and they're also known to eat small to medium-sized fish. There's actually about 12 fish species that are noted to have been found within their diets during gut analysis or observational hunting when divers or observers are watching them do this behavior. They've also been known to eat fish eggs along the reef as well, where they will go into where the fish are hiding along the bankside of the reef and they will eat the eggs from underneath the coral. They typically also, if necessary, will venture off of the reef at night to hunt. This is not as common as the snakes do not like to be in open water, but it does occur. In terms of their predators, you have a variety of different sharks, as they are one of the only things around the reef that are larger than them. This can include nurse sharks, lemon sharks, tiger sharks within their range in northern Australia. It's also very common for osprey, which is a species of bird, to eat them. They're very known for diving in and eating sea snakes. This is actually a picture of an osprey eating a sea snake. I'm not exactly sure what genus it is from, but they are very common predators for Aipysurus laevis and other species as well. So other than that, they don't really have a lot of main predators um, on the coral reef, as many of the species that they're eating or around are smaller species of fish or benthic organisms such as those crabs and prawns. So typically, unless they're interacting with these sharks or they're coming up to breathe, they're not necessarily going to be constantly in the line of sight of those predators. Hopping into their life strategies here, we will start out from their birth. So when these sea snakes are born, again, they're viviparous, meaning that the live young is produced straight from the mother. They are not like sea kraits, which produce eggs and then the young hatch on their own. So the mother sea snake will produce about 6 to 11 young at a time. 11 is about the high point for most of these sea snakes, especially Laevis, and the juveniles are usually significantly darker in color than they are. As they mature and grow, they tend to lighten up and get that lightish tan to silvery gray color, which you can see in most of the pictures that were included. They are typically very solitary during their first year of life, and there's not a lot of information on them at the time. It's very difficult to get information on juvenile sea snakes as well as juvenile sea kraits, as there's not a really good way to find them and track them unless you're doing something with them in human care, which is also not very easy, as they do require these coral benthic environments. So they spend a lot of their first year of life hiding and just feeding regularly, but they're not commonly out, and many people do not see them. They tend to mature over a period of about 3 to 5 years. In males, they will typically mature around 3 years of age, and then females will mature around 4 to 5 years in age. So they take a little bit longer than the males do before they can start reproducing. When it comes to their adult life, they actually do not reproduce every single year. In some of the papers I read on the topic, it mentioned that these snakes need an off year in between to be able to regenerate their energy sources to be able to produce more young, as it does take a lot of energy to be viviparous and carry these individuals for a long period of time and produce nutrients for them until they are ready to leave the mother. So it takes them a lot of time, and typically the females will take an off year, so they're not reproducing every year. They don't have a very fast life history. And they do breed. When they do breed, it's within the summer. So they will release these young throughout the summer, um, over winter until the next spring, and that's typically when you start to see those juveniles hiding amongst the reefs. And again, there's not a whole lot of information about what happens during that period of time before maturity because they are so secluded and solitary. They do tend to aggregate in their adult life heavily along the southern Great Barrier Reef region, but they can be found all across the different reefscapes across northern Australia, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea. So they just heavily aggregate in this specific region, and they're found in less density in other places. Within this area, they will do these nocturnal feeding habits as well as breed within this region. It is said that the breeding process is a bit aggressive, and there is typically a large struggle, and the male will lock with the female, and then he will stay locked with her for about an hour, if not more, and she will continue to go to the surface as necessary to take breaths, and usually drag the male along with her during this period. So he's kind of just attached to her during this breeding process as she does what she needs to do, and make sure she can breathe as well as so that the male can breathe um, during this time. So these snakes do not typically have a lot of threats other than some very general ones that impact um, other species as well. So one of the big main things in these areas is they get caught a lot in fishing trawls. If you guys have never seen what those look like, there's a picture in the top here where they take a large net attached to a boat and they drag this net. It has weights along the bottom. They drag the net across the bottom of the ocean floor and it catches any of these benthic fish, crabs, organisms, and this often catches the sea snakes as well, even though that's not their target organism. They do end up getting caught in these nets and often are bycatch. They are not usually released. They are sometimes killed during this process. Even though they can breathe air, they're not gravitationally adapted and they cannot do well outside of water for long periods of time. So they often die when they're being caught like this. And there's not really a whole lot of regulations in terms of protection over these snakes during these fishing excursions. So it happens pretty often in these areas, and not a whole lot is currently being done about it. Another big thing that's impacting not only these sea snakes but other organisms in these areas is ocean acidification. As more carbon dioxide is off put by society, it tends to sink into the ocean, causing more ocean acidification as it begins to bond with other molecules. And this is really bad for the pH and the stabilization of the ocean as it continues to take in more carbon and the acidity continues to raise. And these corals that the snakes live on are not able to sustain in these areas anymore because the coral reefs are dying, which means the supply of food and shelter that was there previously is no longer. All of the fish that utilize these reefs, they typically cannot live here anymore as the reefs are bleached, which is what you can see in this bottom image, and they start to die. They become very fragile, and it's really hard to, at this point, it's really difficult to bring back a coral system. So it's not something easy, and a lot of people are trying to stop the process of acidification and or benefit coral reef systems by making coral gardens and trying to replant them, but it is a really difficult process, and stopping, in quotations, ocean acidification is not necessarily possible without a very large push from multiple governmental politicians and states and things like that. So it would take a lot of communication across countries and things like that for us to actually be able to lower the risk of continued acidification and do something about these carbon inputs. But until then, we will likely still continue to lose our coral reefs, especially these huge, beautiful reefs in northern Australia, meaning over time we will lose more of our sea snakes. So in terms of that conservation status, they are still listed as least concern, as there are no current estimates on those populations in northern Australia. It is suspected that there are continuous declines throughout this region due to the reef loss, but we're not really sure exactly how it's impacting them yet. Actually, 9% of marine elapids in total are actually threatened with extinction, and then an additional 6% are considered near threatened. But within that grouping as well, 34% is data deficient. So Aipysurus laevis kind of sits within that data deficient region where we're not exactly sure how they are overall impacted by this loss. It's expected that we are losing these snakes slowly over time, but we don't really have an idea of what these numbers look like because they are moving through the ocean, and tracking an aquatic organism in such a large body of water can be difficult, as you may never see that snake again. So methods of transmission and things like that with how to track these snakes may be something to look at in the future to get a better ranking for their protection. As these coral reefs start to die out, not only will it protect the sea snakes to actually build some policies around this, but it will protect all of the species that they feed on and require for shelter as well. So it's really important to start looking into these um, threats as well as these conservation statuses for multiple marine elapids, not even just the olive sea snake, because it will start to impact every single species that we currently know of on these reef systems. Getting into the end of it here, we'll talk about some fun facts that I found. So, following that life history that we talked about, how they live a very long time and they have a slow life history, I found that they could live up to 15 years. This also mentioned that they could live the same 15 years in captivity. So, I did see some information about people keeping them in captivity. Not sure exactly what that looks like, as they would require a decent amount of space for how large they are. But I thought that was pretty interesting. They also typically, when they are catching these benthic prey items, they will bring their prey back to the surface and swallow their prey instead of consuming it underwater. This is likely to do with the consumption of the salt water and how they have to secrete the salt out of their bodies to maintain proper water equalization within their body and outside of their body, which I thought was pretty interesting. I had no idea that they did that. And then these guys actually have sexual head size dimorphism. So there was a paper that looked at general sexual dimorphism within sea snakes, and Aipysurus laevis was included in this study. And actually, laevis was one of the only snake species within this group to have a really distinct difference. So they found, if you look at this graph to the right here, females are in purple and males are in blue, and you can see that they have it by species. And then you have the head length relative to snout vent length, the head width relative to the head length, and the eye diameter relative to the head length. So along all of these graphs, laevis is on the far right side, and you can see that compared to most of these other species, in general, laevis has a much more increased head length than some of these other species, much more increased. So it was quite similar between the two females and males here. But when you get down to head width relative to head length, you can actually see that there is quite a significant difference here, and that the width relative to head length is quite decreased in the males in comparison to the females. If you look at the very bottom graph where it has the eye diameter in relative comparison to the head length, they are quite similar again, but you do see a reversal here where the males have a higher relativity than the females do. And in the paper, they actually stated that females prefer males that have larger eyes, which I thought was pretty interesting. So you can see that that's the only feature here that was flipped, where the males have a larger eye size and eye diameter than the females do, but that was pretty interesting to see that they had some type of sexual dimorphism even just between their head lengths and their head widths as well, as I did not realize that there was any dimorphism along this group of snakes. So, without further ado, thank you guys for listening to my talk, and I hope you enjoyed your run through of the life of Aipysurus laevis.